think maybe we should get started because we have quite a lot to get through today. It's 54 of us here. All right, so welcome everybody. It's wonderful and a real pleasure to have you all here today, and thank you for taking the time to join us. My name's Nadine. I'm a visual anthropologist and a member of Fairpicture's marketing and sales team, and I'll be supporting the moderation of our conversation this afternoon. So we're really thrilled to have so many of you here today for our 8th Fair Talk on ethical fundraising. But before we get started, I come to you from Australia, which is a colonised land that was never ceded. So firstly, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, who were the traditional custodians of the land where Fairpicture's business is conducted in Australia. We honour their continuing connection to land, water, community and the social justice movement, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Just some quick housekeeping. Firstly, for those who are unable to attend today, we'll be recording the session for sharing with participants and those who wish to have a copy that weren't able to come, but also for publishing on our YouTube channel. So if you don't feel comfortable with this but would still like to participate, please just keep your camera off and ask any questions that you may have via the chat box. And we will share a recording of it and the slides in an email to you all following in a couple of days. So let's get started. In our previous Fair Talks, we saw that while ethical communication and ethical photography were very well received communication practices, some participants had questions surrounding ethical fundraising. So we thought it might be really interesting to do a deeper dive into that. So in non-profit communication, fundraising appeals have a special place. They need to communicate the work, both the work of the organization, but also provoke action from the recipient of the communication materials in the form of a donation. And some people would say that you need to show the suffering in order to activate donors. And it's often argued that this leads to an ethical dilemma because ethical communication principles are presumed to lower campaign performance. So this is really what our panel today is going to address in an open discussion, and talk about some of what ethical fundraising means to them, but also their own practices in their own work and organizations. So for today's session, we're really proud to bring you a diverse panel of experts. We welcome Shameen Shah, who's the Global Public Fundraising Lead at ActionAid International. She has extensive experience working with fundraising teams globally to sustain and grow individual giving income. Then Katharina Colano, she's head of PR and online fundraising at NGO Franziskaner Helfen. Prior to this, she worked for 15 years as a journalist and in the TV industry. Jai Cole, he's a Fairpicture visual creator and also a Colombian photographer. And then we have Jörg Arnold, a sociologist, fundraising expert, member of the Fairpicture consulting team and co-founder of Fairpicture. Our agenda today will be rich and fast-paced. We have quite a lot to cover with such a large panel. Firstly, Jorg will commence by providing an overview of ethical fundraising before he hands over to each of the panelists who will speak in turn, sharing information of their own experiences, as well as how they personally implement ethical procedures in their own fundraising practices. And we aim to sort of bring up concepts, ideas, solutions, and things that we can all consider in our own work. Then, as usual, we open the floor up for questions and a general discussion before wrapping up for the afternoon. So it's really important to us to hear your thoughts and ideas. This is a space where we're all coming together to discuss different issues. And of course, your input makes a very successful FairTalk. So thank you everybody for coming and for your commitment to improving our collective storytelling practices. So images are extremely powerful, and I just want to give this example before handing over to Jorg, because this is one example of how much impact one single photo can have. Back in September 2015, when the European refugee crisis was really taking off, an image of a young Syrian child made global headlines after he drowned and washed up on a Turkish beach on the 2nd of September. I'm sure all of us would remember that photograph, but the image was taken by a Turkish journalist and quickly went viral, mobilizing an international empathy and concern over the refugee crisis, which had been ongoing since around May that year, but had not been publicized too widely, especially outside of Europe. So this one image brought in record donations to charitable organizations to aid victims. And I've got a few examples of how donations were impacted by this one photograph. So the number of average daily donations to the Swedish Red Cross's campaign for Syrian refugees was 55 times greater in the week after the photo was published. So generating donations of around 214,000 euros, and the week before was 3,850. Migrant Offshore Aid Station recorded a 15-fold increase in donations within 24 hours of the publication of the image. People Googling refugees in Syria also escalated, and a number of vigils were held globally, of course, with an accompanying call for an increase in refugee intakes. They were also held in Australia. I think this is a really good example because it really does demonstrate how a single photograph documenting the human condition has the power to make people stop, think, and take action by contributing. When a photograph is able to evoke an emotion and feeling, it really does motivate us to action as opposed to abstract thoughts. So, you know, this is something that we need to sort of think about in our work, that people are generally compassionate and that just needs to be aroused. But there are also a number of articles published after the image went global, because some people thought it was very unethical to use such images. So I guess this is one of the questions that we want to answer today, or at least discuss as a group. Is it ethical to use such images, or is it ethical to use stereotypes if we do see a dramatic increase in donations? And does this end justify the means? So the demand for more ethical fundraising is the inspiration for the founding of Fairpicture. And Jorg, I'm directing this at you. So you were a fundraiser yourself for many years and travelled a lot to different project sites. What was the deciding factor for you to start dealing more seriously with ethical fundraising?
Yeah, thank you, Nadine, for the question. Well, as a fundraiser, you expose yourself a lot and you do not really live in the comfort zone of an organization. This has to do with the high pressure to be financially successful. And then it is challenging to tell stories as simply and understandably as possible without exaggerating or making things up because you do not have the story at hand that you need. But what began to concern me more and more in my practice as fundraiser was the responsibility for the people who appeared as protagonists in my fundraising stories. I increasingly asked myself whether I'm doing justice to them and their life situations, or whether they are simply the mere objects of my fundraising work. And in my education as fundraiser, I learned that ethical questions primarily arise when the relationship with my donors is concerned. It was primarily about data protection when it came to my donors' database, about emotional pressure on my donors, about the provenance of the donations I receive. Is it good money or is it bad money? But over time, I discovered, no, it's the other way around. The central ethical question in fundraising revolve around the people featured in the fundraising stories. Who gets to speak? Who owns the story? Whose perspective is being told? And that are the real important ethical questions. To understand ethics in fundraising, I think it is important to see the power structure in the fundraising process, to see who is engaged with which objectives. So as the term donor-centered fundraising has become established in fundraising, it is the donor for whom the story is created. One of the ethical questions is, can the donor really trust the story he is being told? And because they are to be convinced of the need to donate, we use stories about the people situations from the charities project. And those people who provide their stories and pictures are the contributors, as Oxfam says. Two of the ethical questions here are those contributors really free to decide whether they want to contribute their image and their story, or are they not? And second, is the story that is told about them true and contextualized? And the image and stories, they are delivered by a third party. It's the visual storyteller who is expected to tell exactly the stories that will convince the donor. And one of the ethical questions here is the visual storyteller allowed to tell the story he or she witnesses on the spot, or does he or she has to reproduce the ideas a fundraiser who is not familiar with the reality on the ground has in his head? And then the fourth part has the fundraiser. He is the one who addresses all other parties. He has a financial goal with the donor, for which he needs a suitable story and about very specific beneficiaries. And in his briefing, he sets out what the visual storyteller has got to do. So the fundraiser in its position bears a huge ethical responsibility when it comes to the production of a story. And let's go here to the three questions I already mentioned. Who gets to speak? Who owns the story? Whose perspective is being told? And I think we should extend the paradigm of donor-centered fundraising to the paradigm of contributor-centered fundraising or beneficiary-centered fundraising. And in this context, the fundraising academic, some may know him, Adrian Sargent, introduced the terms fundraising frame, fundraising frame and value frame. The fundraising frame argues that charities need to present those images and tell those stories that will motivate people to give the most money to provide services, even if this means showing stereotypical and distressing images on the people in the projects, sometimes termed as poverty porn, as Ger wrote a blog about it recently. And at the other end of the spectrum is the values frame, which argues that charities ought to tell and present stories and images that are not stereotypical, to not discriminate or other the people depicted, and do not represent them as poor, dependent, and without any life chances, without the donor's money. And from an ethical perspective, I think it's clear to me that this value frame should be used in place of the fundraising frame. Even though you've mentioned it, Dean, it is perhaps to be expected that this will lead to less cash income, at least at the beginning. And when I say it is only at the beginning that the income becomes less, it is because I'm convinced, deeply convinced, that the donors not only accept the value frame, but basically are longing for it. Because they are value driven. It is not a stimulus response scheme of advertising that makes them to donors, to regular donors, to donors we can count on. But it's the conviction that they are supposed to share with others. Donating, it's not a purchase of a consumer good, but expression of an attitude of value. And I think at the end, it's very challenging to manage this change in fundraising. As a fundraiser myself, I have got to think differently and put myself at the eye level with the people I put at the center of my story. I need to know a lot more about these people. I need more context to I need more context to the stories. And I need to think about different ways of telling stories and shaping campaigns, and maybe together with my protagonists. And we have enough evidence that this can be done. Our colleague Jess Crumby, I don't know whether she is in the audience, she is working on exactly this. And finally, with my years of experience cooperating with Western photographers in the Global South, this is the moment where the visual creators become important. It makes a lot of sense, in my view, to involve local image creators, local professionals who are familiar with the context in which the project takes place and understand the local language and culture, visual creators who can really connect with the people they are capturing or filming, even in the usually short time they have available for their work. And at the end of the day, I'm really convinced that we can make the world better and fairer with another imagery, images which are not shaped by stereotypical ideas of how the reality in Latin America and Africa or in Asia should be. I think, yes, this was a very long answer to your question, Dean, about where we started with Fairpicture and what personal ethical dilemmas of myself as a fundraiser led to it. But
Thank you so much,
yeah.
Jörg, for that input. Shall we move on? So we move back to this question really about, does the means justify the ends? And we'll continue to refer back to this as each of the panelists also speak about their experience. This is a great quote from the people in the pictures, which is Save the Children report by Jess Crombie and her colleague Warrington. I want to take the photos, not be an object. So provide some perspective of the protagonists. Now I'll hand over to Charmaine, who will speak to her experience.
Thanks, Nadine and Jörg. And hi, everyone. I Sorry, I've got a bit of a sore throat, but I'll try my best. It's just wonderful to be part of this conversation as it's really close to my heart. And I am going to elaborate through some examples from the NGO world, how donors have been supportive of the changes an organization wishes to make, including ethical storytelling. Although I must confess that there is no concrete global data to confirm that ethical storytelling does not have any negative impacts on fundraising. I'll start with ActionAid's story. In 1972, the organization started its work by offering one-to-one support to individual children through child sponsorship. And over 80s and 90s, we changed our approach from needs to a rights-based approach that was a women-focused approach. And the fundraising teams played a very pivotal role in keeping the donors on board with us through this transition. Our donor attrition was not affected, and our loyal donors who believed in our cause have continued to support through this change. Another example I really like to talk about is how organizations shifted their donor communications during COVID. And I know this not just from ActionAid, but from a lot of other international organizations, that individual stories and images were, of course, unsafe and difficult to collect. And organizations at that time modified their communications and adopted creative ways to tell stories to donors. Stories from their own staff, how they were working alongside the frontline activists, their challenges and successes, photos of people wearing masks and not showing their faces and so on. Again, this did not affect donor attrition. On the contrary, I hear from fundraisers that donors were very understanding and accommodating. These examples tell us that if we speak honestly with our donors about our challenges, why we want to make certain changes, how these will impact the people we work with, donors will understand. I'm going to give you some examples from ActionAid and then move on to some other organizations. So ActionAid's leadership has made a commitment towards decolonization. Our internal processes and external engagements, including fundraising, are being reviewed through this lens. And some ActionAid countries have also made shifts in the way that they're talking about fundraising on their websites or on social media platforms, gradually moving away from the donor-centric approach towards a more partnership-oriented narrative. Some examples are ActionAid UK, Ireland, Sweden, Denmark. You're welcome to take a look at their websites. And ActionAid has also made conscious decisions to move away from using exploitative images. So if you look at our websites, most of the images being used in our recent appeals are positive images. And ActionAid Brazil have launched a new individual giving product, and all the images of women are positive images. We've also set up an innovation collective at the global level for countries to come together and co-create new individual giving products. Our overarching value is to remain conscious of decolonial and anti-racist considerations in the innovation process. And any new product that is being developed through this lens. Informed consent, like you were mentioning, is a very integral part of the process, and all staff are trained in collecting and recording consent, making sure that people are fully on board for why images and stories are being collected, and that they have the right to withdraw anytime that they want. And ActionAid ActionAid UK actually started an initiative in 2019 called Women by Women, which led to all fundraising and comms content being sourced in ethical ways by local women photographers and journalists. The stories and images gathered are consequently better because contributors feel more understood and feel more relaxed sharing their stories with local women journalists in their own language. Now all their fundraising communications are reviewed by the anti-racist storytelling manager before sharing on social media or sending to donors. Furthermore, all ActionAid UK staff have to undergo an anti-racist and decolonial training to better understand the need to shift power from the white-centric world. Another example I'd like to give you is from Chance for Childhood, and they call this initiative Overexposed. They have made a conscious decision to stop using children's faces in their images, and they have not received any pushback from their donors. You might have all heard about AMREF's report called Who Owns the Story? And the data clearly demonstrates that supporters preferred stories being told by contributors themselves rather than the curated and branded content by AMREF. The contributor-led fundraising packs requested a higher gift and raised more money in comparison to AMREF's produced pack. And the supporters said that they felt more closer to the people leading their struggles. They felt that they have more agency to make change and that there was less focus on the charity organization. A donor also said that it's good to see old paternalistic model of charitable donation give way to a realization that Africans are capable of making their own decisions about how to help their community. To sum up, fundraisers have the power to influence donors, to understand and embrace the values and principles an organization upholds, particularly if they're able to show how these changes impact the people we work with. From experience, I can say that change can happen by showing evidence to the organization's senior management to create that buy-in. And this can be done by starting small, through pilots, and then scale-ups of positive results. As fundraisers, I think we need to really ask ourselves, are we too averse to risk as fundraisers? Do we underestimate the empathy that donors have towards the cause that they support? So yeah, thanks. That's what I wanted to contribute. Handing over to you, Nadine.
Oh, thank you so much, Charmaine, for sharing your vast and deep experience with us. I think these examples are really interesting and definitely highlight that fundraising images can be both respectful, ethical, and financially effective. I'd now like to hand over the microphone to Katarina to share her thoughts and experiences with us.
Thank you very much. So hi. When we talk about ethics and fundraising, using photos, stories, and video content, beginning from production, selection, creating a story, and the long-term use, we can compare it to similar situations in journalism and media. Before I started my job at the NGO Franziskaner Helfen in PR and online fundraising, I worked around 15 years as a journalist and in the TV industry. And so I see similarities and overlaps, but also differences. Our topic today is ethics and fundraising. And in the intro text to this FairTalk, I've read a few questions, and I guess we all know them. For example, is it okay to show pictures of people in really bad situations, suffering, to create more donations? My answer is no. Are we allowed to use stereotypical images in fundraising? My answer is no. But even if my answer to these questions are very short and clear, the discussion about these topics are long and extensive. This is the reason why we are all together on this panel today, why we have been dealing with these topics for a longer time. Because the how-to is not easy, because we have to think over and over again about how to implement it in our work and campaigns. As Nadine told us, image send a clear message. Our visual recognition is much faster than you think. That's why images are incredibly important and so powerful in communication. As fundraisers, our main goal is a good communication to get in touch with our donators and of course to get donations to help people in need. Both in journalism and fundraising, we need good pictures, we need good stories. And in both fields, we want to show reality and create attention. In German, there's the very popular saying, I believe what I see. We believe in images, but we also shape them, interpret them in our own way. The magazine Spiegel has a very popular claim, quoted by its founder, the journalist Rudolf Augstein. Sagen, was ist. Saying what is. But what is what it is? It sounds so clearly objective and true. We have to think about cultural differences, misunderstandings, perspectives, and approaches. So what is reality? What is construction? Where does it become stereotypical or overdrawn? We have to ask ourselves these questions over and over again. But there are also some differences between the media and NGOs. Especially in television, the concept of image rights has been a big issue for a long time and is part of everyday work. However, in some cases, it's unfortunately more a question of securing image rights for publishers and TV stations. Another difference, most time newspapers and news channels are reporting about the current situation, the day. When things change tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, they will report again. And time is short, pressure is on. Our work, our fundraising is mostly long-term. Of course, our projects are long-term. Even our emergency aid is a long-term compared to daily agenda-driven media reporting. That means looking at the whole storyline, we can choose the point from which we should like to tell the story. We can choose the pictures. So we have the possibility to think about images, to talk to people. We can choose places, settings, and times for a photo shoot. We can choose to show laughing children, women who are safe right now, people who have survived the worst. And another point which is very similar, trust. The people we photograph, whose stories we tell, they trust us. They trust us that we handle their photos, information, and stories very carefully. And also readers, viewers, and donors, they trust us. They believe that our stories and images are reality, that we are saying what it is, that we not only take good care of the humans in our projects, long-term and sustainable, but we are also responsible for our communication with the people who are pictures we show and stories we tell. We have relationships with our beneficiaries, project partners, and donors. And good relationships are based on trust. So working at my NGO Franziskaner Helfen, how do we deal with ethical issues? We are on our way, and like many other topics, we are constantly improving and trying to get better. Working for a Franciscan NGO, our project partners are a worldwide network of Franciscan sisters and brothers. Mostly of them are locals or living long-term with locals, so they are familiar with the cultures, situations, and are long-term connected to the projects and beneficiaries. Most of the photos we use are taken by the Franciscans itself or employees of the projects. This makes some things easy, but on the other hand, we have to deal with a lot of photos that do not meet our technical or content requirements we need for fundraising in Germany. We try as often as we can to work together with local photographers, also with Fairpicture. Some time ago, we developed an image guideline. We have a photo and story briefing for our project partners, and we review our communication and campaigns. A few concrete examples of how we work. It is important to us to show positive images and scenes, success stories, and show how things have improved. It is so important to involve the people before the shooting, talking about photo permissions and a consent form. Talk to each other on location, showing them the pictures afterwards. Do they like them? We avoid portraits or close facial shots in sensitive situations. In our stories, we only use the first name of persons, so it's not possible to Google their names. And what do we do in our office when we select images? Say no to posting pictures you don't feel comfortable about. You are not sure if this picture is okay? Then, in most cases, it's not. Imagine it's you on the photos, your child, nephew, friend, grandmother. Would you release that picture then? Dealing with all the pictures of ethical fundraising is a long term. We have to deal with all the questions further and deeper. I think this is the most important thing to me, to our work. We have to go on, thinking, listen, Speaking, acting, changing, rethinking, reacting. We have to learn a lot. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katarina, for sharing this with us and your knowledge and experience. We're really grateful. So taking all this on board, referring back to our question, it really does seem that the means of using negative or stereotypical images does not, in fact, justify the ends of raising more money. Let's hear now from Jai Cole, a Colombian photographer and Fairpicture visual creator. Over to you, Jai.
Thank you so much, Nadim. Thank you so much to all your panelists. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night. I am Jair Cole, a Colombian photographer, 26 years old, and I would like to focus on how our Colombian context made things difficult to tell stories. We don't have only to pay attention in the ethical issues of the photos, of not stealing the dignity of the people we take photographs of, but also we can not only expose them to this violent context that we live in Colombia. And to give you some context and idea of what we are dealing in here in the country. After the peace process in 2016, there are still guerrillas and groups dedicated to the narco-traffic business, and these things, these contexts affect communities in the most remote areas where state services don't get them. So this state is replaced by this illegal group. So when these people travel to meetings and to talk about their problems, and you are there to expose the stories, to talk about this reality that affects them, you have to be very careful in order not to show, for example, their faces or their names, or if they want to talk about these problems, you might have to change their identities, because as soon as the illegal groups know about these people, know about, they are telling too much about this reality, about how they affect this community, they can declare them as military targets. That's the term they use, unfortunately, here in Colombia. So there's the first point. For example, last week I was covering a meeting for the UN, the Program of Development, and there was a meeting for victims of forced disappeared people. And there were a few women that that wasn't comfortable in showing their faces, although they shared their experience. That's the first topic that I want to talk about. The second one is that although I haven't had my experience with NGOs, I have worked with, for example, like these homes of Open Society Foundations and the Program of Development of the United Nations. There's like a narrative they want to expose, like very typical, of showing the kids smiling or doing this gesture. That's like, or photographing meetings between the beneficiaries, the recipients of the NGO and the representatives of the NGO. I think we should expand our idea of what kind of stories we can tell about these people, how we can involve them. For example, in documentary photography, there's a new term that has become popular in recent years: expanded photography, which means that the subject, that the protagonist of the story is also a creator of the story, how they can relate in the creation, in the development of the product, or the final product. And that's basically what I want to talk about. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Jar. And thank you to all the panelists. I'd like to now open up the floor. There's some really interesting discussions going on in the meeting chat. Matt Parks has presented a really interesting example. I've had quite a similar experience working as a photographer in the field, and it's really horrific actually too, because you feel a sense of guilt. But I'm not sure if anybody wants to ask some questions, or if some of you in the meeting chat would like to move this over to the video. Ben, yeah, please.
Hi everyone. Oh, is my camera working? There we go. Hi everyone. That was a really interesting chat. I think I've been working in the industry for about sort of 15 years now, and sort of ethical storytelling and how people are depicted on camera has always been sort of very high in my priority list. So this has really been a really interesting chat. I guess a quick question stroke sort of thought. A lot of the work I've been seeing over the past sort of, especially sort of 5 or 6 years, if you're going out to capture a campaign and you're capturing images for that campaign, it can be done very ethically. It can be done with a lot of these sort of considerations in mind. But a lot of the time that content doesn't end there. It's often then used by other teams. It's often then used by other, you know, larger organizations might have lots of different variations of that organization. And that images might get used out of context, or it might get changed in its overall, the overall kind of messaging around it, or it could be used as part of a sort of a collection of things that gets lost in the mix a little bit. Do you have any sort of, I guess, do you have any sort of thoughts or kind of any sort of work you've done around how content is used outside of campaigns? That's quite a broad question, sorry.
Do one of our panelists want to respond to this?
Yes, maybe.
Yeah, I think, oh, sorry.
Sorry. Go on.
I think this is a quite good question, Ben, because when you have once the photographs in the archive, maybe some people could use it a few years later. I think we have to talk about this topic, what it means, because in a lot of cases, people say, oh, this child is smiling so nice. I will put this photo in a different context. And I think that some people are not really aware of this. And maybe we also have to put this in our talks to the beneficiaries, that they say, okay, this photo is nice, but just for this kind of campaign and so on. So I think we have to have this question in mind for the whole process of producing stories and photos. And of course, talk to the people in the fundraising team, that they are also responsible how they use their photos and when and how long.
Cool, thank you.
Jai, did you want to add something?
Yeah,
yeah, go on.
yes, and maybe to add, you mentioned before, Katharina, that we have to put the question over and over again and again. We have to enter into discourse also in the organizations, and it's not done with writing down or with having somewhere the visual guidelines. They must live in the organization, and the organization are obliged to establish them in the daily life of communication. And that means also constant training, as Charmaine mentioned. That needs also a dedicated person or a dedicated structure that is really examining what the results of the communication. And then it's also at last, it's a constant learning. It's not about blaming situations or blaming campaigns which fail maybe, but it's about learning in the organization, and it's a process.
Thanks, Jörg. Jai, do you want to add something to the conversation?
Well, I would love to bring our experience we have with Reddit Homes. I recently finished a reportage about a foundation known as Foundation Paz y Bien, Peace and Good. The NGO the fundraising decide to gather consents to the people that I photographed in order to have like protocol. And and also I will choose like two protagonists besides the activities I have to photograph, in order to give like some comfort to these people and say them that you are okay. This is a safe space in which you can learn you can share your experience, your values, your thoughts, and it's important to like formalize all these things so that the people can know that they are going to be exposed in social media, in international outlets, and so on.
Thanks, Jar. Does somebody else have a question that they want to ask? Laura Kalmar's written something in the meeting chat that's really, really interesting. And I'm not sure if you want to talk a little bit about your organization and if this is something that you're sort of struggling with, or maybe the question there would be what sort of information would you need to convert people within the organization to see things in a slightly different way? I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but she says, I'm really grateful for. Are you there? I can't see you.
I'm here. Yeah. Thanks. It's fine. You can put me on the spot.
Sorry.
No,
it's just really interesting.
Yeah, well, I'm finding this really interesting, and like I think ethically and in terms of principle, I'm right on board. But in terms of practice, it's always a little bit hard to convince, executive directors or the fundraising folks to say, we want to move to this more ethically based or values-based fundraising model, and they're looking at the numbers and they're saying, well, just show us what sort of impact it's going to make on our fundraising. And I do think that in our organization, so we're a Canada and US based organization. We work in about 45 countries, and we've got a real emphasis on peace building. So this isn't outside of our ethics and principles. It's just trying to understand what impact this might have. So is it going to decrease fundraising? And that might be okay. Like, we might be able to say we're fine with that because we do want to more ethically portray the communities and the partners with whom we work. But they're going to want to know, like, are we going to take a 10% cut in fundraising? Are we going to take a 20% cut in fundraising? And I'm hearing people say, well, the donors were fine with it. But that's sort of it sounds risk. More like just it's a risk, but it also sounds more like a narrative comment that we didn't hear anything back from the donors, so we figured we were fine. And it would be just really super interesting to know if there was actually some concrete studies where, almost like an A/B test, we use this, going back to that first comment, sorry, I can't remember who made it, Matt, if you did an A/B test with those two images to actually see which one raised more money or didn't, or did the other one really take a hit for the organization or would have. So it just would be, that's sort of playing with images a bit, but if there was some sort of study where we could actually see, we use this image and this was the result, we use this image and this was the result. And then it would also just also layer onto this, it would be a great luxury to be able to go back to every partner and community and say, how do you like the way we've portrayed you? Like, how are you feeling about the way we've portrayed you? But we produce so much content that it's just absolutely not feasible to go back to every partner or participant and ask them about how they think that we've used their image. Anyway, it's lots of questions, and we are using Fairpicture. So we're really super excited about partnering with you and leaning into it, but just lots of questions.
No, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing, Laura. We really appreciate it. And Abby's addressed this in the meeting chat, and I think Charmaine's maybe going to mention this as well. Charmaine, do you want to respond to Laura?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Laura. That's a really great question. I think a lot of organizations would be thinking about that, and it's valid. Like I said, I don't think that we've got global data suggesting, how this is going to impact fundraising, but there are lots of small, evidences and stories of what organizations are doing, how it's impacted their fundraising. And I can speak for ActionAid that the approach that we've taken is, doing small pilots. And so the Women by Women also started as a small pilot, and it showed results, and the organization bought into it. And that is how the change occurred. And likewise, someone also suggested AMRA's study again in the chat, and I think that's a really great example because it gives you that data of how supporters responded. It is true that it's not always possible to go with A/B testing for everything that we're testing in our audiences. But I think these are really great ways to kind of approach this, and just doing short surveys off and on with our donors, with new things that we're doing, gives us a bit of an insight. And I really believe that oftentimes we're more afraid to try out something only because there's so much money attached to this. So I think it's just about taking those small brave steps at a time and trying to see if they're working or not.
Thanks so much, Charmaine. Zara, your hand is up. Would you like to speak?
Yes, and thanks everybody. Thanks Fairpicture for doing this in the first place, and thank you for all of the great comments in the chat. I no longer work for an NGO, but I was with one who just hired Fairpicture as I was leaving. But I think there's two things that you have to consider when you're trying to make that shift within your organization. There's the evidence that's external that you can benchmark against. So things like this AMRA study, the work that the community-centric fundraising movement is doing in North America, they're trying to produce that evidence base. But there's also little things that you can demonstrate for your particular organization. So if you do your own mini little tests and build those up over time, then you can have the evidence base of what works with your donors, because at the end of the day, your base is your base. That's one part of it. And the second part of it, I think it comes down to an overall, I said this in the chat as well, but an overall focus on process. And that process is also impacted by the organization's approach to programming, approach to developing partnerships, their ethical approach, their DEI approach, all of these things, they're all interconnected. And I'm sorry, I have a lot of glare behind me, so you can't see my face. But when you invest in those processes, you can be a little more sure that you do have the active participation of the people that are sharing their stories with you. One of the things that I appreciated when we were exploring using Fairpicture was that really detailed consent process. And another thing that I instituted before I left, which is the bare minimum, but it's something to build on. I did a story report. So the organization had like 2 rounds of collection per year to the communities, and with those requests came a report of how the previous stuff was used. And then they were asked to share with the community members, and some of the community members did see it, and they were able to give their feedback and things like that. And just having those opportunities internally to pull that feedback is one way to kind of get around that within your organization. You can't, as you said, you cannot reach every single person for every single image. It's just not feasible.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Really appreciate that, your input. Look, we're almost right on time, and I'm really mindful to end at 6 o'clock. So there's some amazing comments in our meeting chat and some great questions. In terms of from our side, how Fairpicture can support. So we do provide and produce fair and ethical photo and video content for organisations that need some support. And we do that by using our local visual creators globally. We also have an image fairness analysis tool that's on our website. There's a link on the slide, but we can send this to you after the FairTalk when we send the recording. So you can just click on that and try to work through. It's maybe 5 minutes. We also have a consulting arm. So if there's something in particular that you need support with, such as developing ethical policies, we can help with that, or do a quick review of communication needs. And you can also continue with this FairTalk content in your own organizations. Lastly, we have recently launched it's not per se a Fairpicture group, it's a group for everybody. Really it's set up to be a community for people interested in ethical communications and storytelling. So again, the LinkedIn group is posted in the slides, so you can just click on that. And it's really a place that we're trying to set up for everybody to engage with like-minded practitioners, such as what's happening in the meeting chat. So I'd really love to see some of you maybe move over to that LinkedIn group and continue these discussions there. And we can post some resources and different things that were referred to in this FairTalk as well. It will be an easier way to share information. And if you find that really useful and you're so inclined, it'd be great if you can also invite your own networks so that we can grow our community that way. So that's it. We really look forward to seeing you at our next FairTalk in October. We'll let you know through our regular channels, through email, invite, and updates on LinkedIn. And thank you to everybody for taking the time. Our panelists, we really appreciate it. There's a lot of work that goes on before you actually even get to the FairTalk. So we're very thankful that you took that time for us, and time to attend and share, of course. And to everybody else for contributing to the conversation. So yeah, thank you. Until next time, and we look forward to seeing you on the Fairpicture platform or in the LinkedIn group. Have a good evening, everyone.